Friends, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite cult podcasts that I have listened to. And yes, I have listened to a few, in fact. I don't typically stray too far from my beloved true crime podcast, but every once in a while a different one jumps out my way. And I came across the Heaven's Gate podcast back in the fall. And I'm someone who doesn't necessarily know a lot about cults, but I'm always really interested and curious about them. Because I'm being honest, they kind of fascinate me. I think it's interesting to know that there are just different people who gravitate towards the same belief, or that they're able to be convinced to believe in the same thing. And they can be super controversial. And so when I came across Heaven's Gate, I did know a little bit about the group. All I knew was back in, I think 1999 it was, they were on the news for having committed suicide as a group, and they were all wearing a very distinctive outfit. And I was only about 6 at the time, so I've learned that from much later in my life. I didn't learn it when I was that young, but I was very curious to know about it. The podcast, I think, is really interesting in the sense that it is also narrated by a man named Glenn Washington, a person who himself grew up in a religious cult. And it's interesting to have him narrate it because I think he brings a level of understanding and humanity and empathy to this podcast or this group in a way that I think somebody who hadn't been raised in that particular format would have been able to bring to it. The other interesting layer about Glenn Washington is that he is a man of color who was raised in a predominantly white religious group, which I thought was really interesting to hear that layer of it as well. He does include a couple of bonus episodes where he talks about his own experience, but the podcast itself is really focused on Heaven's Gate. And what I found really interesting and unique about this cult podcast was that it really takes you through the founding members of the group, and it helps you understand that they didn't just one day wake up and go let's make a cult, but it really helps you understand the journey that T and Doe went through along the way, the two main leaders of the Heaven's Gate cult. And it really helps you understand sort of in a way how they ended up where they did in 1999, where they all chose to, as they call it, leave their vehicles and move on to the next phase of their afterlife beyond being in their human forms. And so while it might sound really ridiculous, I have to say the way they take you through the journey and the way Glenn Washington narrates it, it doesn't feel so far-fetched. It doesn't feel like such a ridiculous concept, and I appreciate that. I'm not saying the goal of the podcast is to make you want to join a cult, not by any means, but it really helps to, in a way, humanize the experience of these people, and it helps you understand that, even though you may not believe or agree with what they did, they believed strongly in themselves, and they found a place when they felt like they didn't have one. I think that's really interesting to look at. So it's not necessarily focused on the over-the-top ridiculousness or the views of society on cults. It really just focuses on the experience of the cult itself. And it brings in, former members who withdrew from the group Heaven's Gate before they ended up where they ended up. It brings in one of the founding members' daughters who literally abandoned her child and her whole family to start this cult. Didn't raise her kids in it or didn't bring her kids into it. So it's interesting to hear from her daughter's point of view. They just have so many facets of this world. They also bring in, which I think really interesting, they bring in a lot of video clips that the members were filming to educate newer members. They also bring in clips of the videos that were filmed before each one of the members took the dosage that ended their life. And so there are a lot of voices in here that I think help you better understand where those people were mentally when they were joining this group or when they were a part of this group. It also maybe helps you understand how the group got to where they got to at the very end in 1999. So it's definitely one that I was yearning for week to week. I don't normally listen to podcasts as they come out. I normally am someone who either waits for them to be all together in one lump sum so I can binge them, or I find them after they've already aired. And so again, I can binge them, but I had to wait week by week for this one. And it was just so interesting and fascinating. So if you're somebody who doesn't know a lot about cults in general and want to learn more, or you can recall the Heaven's Gate group having committed suicide and then wanting to know like more of the backstory, I feel like this is a really interesting way to approach it. I have listened to a couple of other cult podcasts that I thought were interesting, but they weren't necessarily as educational as I found this one to be, and they weren't necessarily as in-depth as I found this one to be. The episodes, I think, are not too long where it's like going on, and there aren't too many in number. I think they really were thoughtful in how they approached it. They did quite a bit of research, and they really organized and succinctly provided us with enough episodes to understand the full scope of this particular podcast. So I would be really curious if you've listened to Heaven's Gate. What were your thoughts about it down below? I've also listened to Dear Franklin Jones, which I thought was just okay, another podcast focused on a cult. If you have any other cult podcasts that you think I should listen to, let me know in the comments below, because I'm not as well versed in those as I am at true crime, but I'll be very curious to hear from you guys, and I hope that you enjoyed my little mini review on the fabulous podcast Heaven's Gate. I'll talk to you in the next video real soon. Bye.